Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Yud Zayin Mishnah Het. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. As an introduction to today's Mishnah, we know that it is rabbinically forbidden for one to replace the cover of a hole in the ground, for example, a pit or well, because he appears to be making a permanent addition to the ground, which is the biblical melacha of building. Likewise, one may not remove such a cover because he seems to be demolishing a permanent structure, which is biblically forbidden under the melacha of demolishing. If the cover has a handle, however, replacing or removing it is permitted because the handle shows that the cover is not intended to be part of the ground, but is just a utensil that covers a hole in the ground. The Mishnah discusses whether the cover of a vessel that is attached to the ground, such as an oven or a stove, is treated in this regard like the cover of a hole in the ground. All covers of vessels that are attached to the ground may be moved on Shabbat if they have handles. If the cover has a handle, it is clearly meant to be removed and replaced, and therefore using the cover does not resemble the biblically prohibited act of building or demolishing. But if the cover does not have a handle, one may not use it, just as one may not use such a cover to close or open a hole in the ground. Amar Rabbi Yossi said, in what case was this distinction between a cover with a handle and one without a handle stated? It was stated in regard to covers of holes in the ground, where using a cover that lacks a handle indeed resembles building. However, in regard to covers of vessels that are attached to the ground, ben kach uben kach nitalim b'Shabbat, in either case, whether they have handles or not, they may be moved on Shabbat. And the commentators explain, the Rav says, Rabbi Yossi argues that a vessel attached to the ground is not considered like a hole in the ground, but like a movable vessel. Therefore, covering it is the same as covering a movable vessel, which is certainly permitted even if the cover does not have a handle. So it comes out Rabbi Yossi is disagreeing with the Tana Kama, with the Chachamim. However, the Rav tells us, the halacha follows the sages, even if the vessel is attached to the ground, it has the same status of covering a hole in the ground, and in order to cover it, the cover has to have a handle. And that is the end of Mishnah Chet of chapter 17. We begin now with chapter 18, Mishnah 1. This chapter deals with exceptions to the rabbinic prohibition against excessive exertion on Shabbat. The first Mishnah discusses cases where the rabbis permitted excessive exertion for the sake of a mitzvah. Mefanin afilu arba vechamesh kupot shel teven v'shel tvua. We may clear away even 4 or 5 large boxes of straw or grain, despite the effort involved. And the Rav explains the words 4 or 5 are not intended to be precise. Lav dafka kamar. The intent is that there's no limit to how many boxes may be cleared away. Mipnei ha'ochim u'mipnei bitul bet midrash. The Mishnah says to make room for guests or to make room for students and prevent them from being absent at the study hall. And the commentators explain, since hosting guests and studying Torah mitzvot, the rabbis permitted excessive exertion in these cases. Avalot ha'otzar, however, one may not empty the storehouse, thereby exposing the earthen floor, because one might smooth out bumps and holes in the ground, which is a form of the melacha of building. Now, although the rabbis lifted their prohibition of excessive exertion for a mitzvah, they did not lift their prohibition of muktzah. Later on, the Mishnah will list a number of items that may not be cleared away because they are muktzah. But before doing so, the Mishnah lists items that are not muktzah and may therefore be cleared away for the sake of a mitzvah, even if excessive exertion is required. Mifanin tiruma teora. We may clear away tiruma that is tahor, which is not muktzeh, because it's fit for a kohen. Again, the Rav explains, tiruma is the first portion that must be separated from produce grown in Eretz Yisrael. It may be eaten only by a kohen and the members of his household. Nevertheless, it's not muktzeh even to a non-kohen, because it may be eaten by a kohen. Udemai, we may clear away demai, which is fit for the poor, as the Rav explains, the commentators explain, demai is produce obtained from an unlearned person in Am Haaretz. It's possible that such produce is tevel, untithed produce, because some Am Haaretz did not separate all the required portions. So to prevent people from eating tevel, which is biblically prohibited. The rabbis decreed that one must tie demai before eating it. Now, under biblical law, demai is permitted because most amei haaretz do tie their produce properly, and the rabbis in this case made an exception in the case of poor people and allowed them to eat demai without first tithing. The general exception in Mishnah Masechet Demai, chapter 3, Mishnah 1, the rabbis made an exception in the case of poor people and allowed them to eat demai without first tithing it. So since demai may be eaten by a poor person, it is not muktzeh, as Tosfot explained in Masechet Shabbat, page 127b. The Mishnah continues, U'maaser rishon shenitla terumato, maaser rishon whose terumat maaser has been separated, which is fit for anyone. And the commentators explain, after separating terumah, one must separate a tenth of what remains. We call maaser rishon, first tithe, and give it to a Levi. However, even maaser rishon may not be eaten until the Levi separates a tenth of it, what we call terumat maaser, which must be given to a kohen. Before the terumat maaser has been separated, maaser rishon is tevel and may not be eaten. But after the separation of terumat maaser rishon is permitted for all. So again, you can clear that away. U'maaser sheni ve'ekdesh shenifdu, maaser sheni and consecrated produce that have been redeemed, which are also fit for anyone. And the commentaries continue to explain, after separating terumah and maaser rishon from produce, one must separate a tenth of the remainder. In most years, one is obligated to take this tenth called maaser sheni to Jerusalem and eat it there, or redeem it with money, which one must then take to Yerushalayim and use to buy food that he eats there. This is the law in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. The second tenth that is separated in the third and sixth years must be given to the poor, what we call maaser ani. Now, produce that was consecrated, what we call donated to the temple treasury, is hektish, and therefore it's prohibited for use until it is redeemed with money, which then assumes the status of hektish. Once maaser sheni and consecrated produce have been redeemed with money, they lose their sanctity and may be eaten by any person, any place. So again, the Mishnah says you can clear that away. V'atumos ayavesh mipnei shu machal aniyim, and the dried lupin, which is food for the poor. And the commentators explain dry lupins are so bitter that they are not usually eaten. Nevertheless, they are not muktzeh because they are eaten by poor people. And the Mishnah specifies dry lupins because fresh ones are not edible at all. Now, all of these items are not muktzeh because they are eaten by at least some people. The Mishnah now lists items that may not be cleared away on Shabbat, even for a mitzvah, because they are muktzeh. Aval lo et tevel. However, we may not clear away tevel, which is muktzeh, because it may not be eaten by anyone. V'lo maaser rishon shelo nitla terumato, nor maaser rishon whose terumat maaser has not been separated, which also may not be eaten by anyone. V'lo et maaser sheni ve'ekdesh shelo nifdu, neither maaser sheni outside of Yerushalayim and consecrated produce that have not been redeemed, because maaser sheni is prohibited outside Yerushalayim and consecrated items are prohibited everywhere. V'lo et aluf, neither raw loof, a type of legume which is inedible. Raw loof is not fit even for animals, the Rav says, and it cannot be made fit to eat on Shabbat when cooking is forbidden, as Rashi explains on his commentary in Masechet Baba Mitzia, page 113b. Velo achaldar, and neither mustard seeds, which are also inedible, as Rashi there explains, mustard seeds cannot be eaten until they are ground, and grinding is forbidden on Shabbat. And therefore, all these items may not be cleared away on Shabbat because being unfit for consumption, they are muktzeh. Now the commentators explain many of the Mishnah's rulings would seem obvious. For example, it should go without saying that maaser rishon whose terumat maaser has been separated is not muktzeh, since there's no question that it is a permitted food. And conversely, it's obvious that maaser sheni whose terumah has not been separated is a forbidden food. Now the rulings about maaser sheni, consecrated property, and tevel also appear to be unnecessary. Now the Gemara cited by the Rav explains why the Mishnah included these rulings, and that's what the commentaries deal with on the spot. But we will not get into that. The next Tana disagrees now about loof. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel matir baluf mipnei shu machal orvin. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel permits clearing away raw loof on Shabbat because it is food for ravens and therefore not muktzeh. And the Rav explains, although raw loof is not eaten by most animals, it is fed to ravens and therefore it's not muktzeh, because wealthy people, for example, raise ravens as a sign of prestige. And the Rav does tell us, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the halacha does not follow Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.